Hi, and welcome to this video introducing the Norwegian language. I'm Adam, and I'll be your teacher. Norwegian is spoken by about 5 million people. It is the primary official language of Norway and spoken by about 90% of the population as a first language. Geographically, it's the majority language in all of Norway, with the exception of 2 municipalities in the north, where this position is instead held by North Sami. Norwegian is, however, the common language of Norway and is spoken and understood by the entire population. The Norwegian alphabet consists of the Latin alphabet, with 3 extra letters attached at the end, and is identical to the Danish alphabet, with which it is also related. The extra letters are proper letters in their own right, and are not regarded as variations of A, E, O, or A, as you can see and hear in words such as stare, skvære, stor, stør, and lag, låg. Now, a very distinguishing feature of Norwegian, and one of the most important things to learn about, is that Norwegian actually has 2 official written standards. That's right, and I'm not talking about 2 different languages here, but 2 standardized and official ways of writing the same language. It's not a very common thing to do, so I can understand if this might seem puzzling to you. Anyway, the names of these 2 language forms are nynorsk and bokmål. The original meanings of these names are modern Norwegian and book language, respectively, but today the names are completely standalone, and nobody really cares about what they originally referred to. Also, I want to reiterate that these are different written forms of the same language and that nobody speaks them. The language is simply Norwegian, no matter how you write it. Anyway, to get a better grip on this situation, let's look at some history. In 1537, shortly after the collapse of the Kalmar Union, Norwegian sovereignty was effectively ended and the country became a province of Denmark. This led to a complete stop in the writing of Norwegian, which until then had had quite a rich literary tradition, and instead writing was done only in Danish. Then, in 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars, Norway declared its independence, and with a newfound sense of nationalism, people started to think about, not writing in Danish anymore. But then Sweden came along and forced Norway into a union, and then the Norwegians were like, oh well, at least it's not Swedish, and so they kept writing in Danish. But the question remained, and all throughout the 19th century, there was a hot debate on how to actually implement a written Norwegian language. And this is where the entire thing starts, because there were 2 camps, with different ideas on how to actually do this. On the one hand, you had the opinion, let's not break with tradition, and the language people already know how to write. Let's just make it more Norwegian, step by step, until it better represents how we actually speak. This position was mainly held by conservatives and by middle-class urban dwellers. And this makes sense since Norwegian and Danish are closely related to begin with, and since the spoken language of the urban upper classes had been significantly influenced by Danish and the Danish written language, and thus they wouldn't have to modify it all that much before it was a reasonable representation of their speech. Well, that and the fact that most people do tend to be quite conservative when it comes to language. Anyway, the other opinion was basically, well, screw this. Let's just get rid of everything and start over, and make a new written language based on how Norwegians actually speak. This position was advocated primarily by liberals and by non-urban dwellers. And this position makes sense too, since the spoken language outside of the major cities was generally so distant from the written language that it'd be way simpler to just make a new written language than try to fit the old Danish one onto it. And what happened then was that both of these movements prevailed. The Norwegianization of the Danish standard resulted in bokmål, and the creation of an entirely new Norwegian standard gave today's nynorsk. Strength-wise, bokmål has always had the advantage over nynorsk since it didn't start from zero, although up until the Second World War, the gap was closing rapidly, and in the 1940s, about a third of elementary school pupils were using nynorsk as their primary written form. But since nynorsk failed to get a foothold in the major urban areas, post-war urbanization and exclusion in mass media led to a decline in its use. Today, about 15% of the total population are users of nynorsk, and about 85% are users of bokmål. And when it comes to using the other variety, users of nynorsk are more likely to be proficient in bokmål than the other way around. As an example of the difference between the 2 language forms, here are some common words written in both of them, that you can also use when trying to identify what variety a text is written in. But remember that even though these words are different, there are also a whole lot of words that are completely identical in the 2 language forms. Geographically, bokmål is the official written form in 158 municipalities, primarily in eastern and northern Norway. Nynorsk is the official written form in 113 municipalities, primarily in western Norway. The remaining 157 municipalities are officially neutral, but in practice, bokmål tends to dominate in such places. We can also note that of the 20 largest municipalities, none use nynorsk as their official language form, regardless of location, which further reflects the historical status of bokmål in the urban areas. And here I want to make another thing clear, and that is that this municipal distribution of nynorsk and bokmål as official language forms does not necessarily correspond to the spoken language in these areas. In fact, neither variety is based on the speech of a specific region, and as you saw earlier, the geographic distribution of the two varieties hasn't always been the same either. Of course, the present distribution is not entirely coincidental either, but the relationship between the two written varieties and the spoken language is a complex issue, and we're probably better off saving this for another presentation. Anyway, let's talk about the spoken Norwegian language instead. Compared to most other Western languages, dialects in Norwegian have a very strong position and have not been streamlined or replaced to the same extent as those of many other languages of Europe. In theory, every dialect is equally valid and considered correct Norwegian, and there is no officially promoted standard spoken language. In practice, however, this can vary significantly. In general, urban dialects and varieties that take many elements from the written language often enjoy high covert prestige, especially in southeastern Norway. On the other hand, in many areas the local dialect enjoys equally high status, and speaking a dialect close to the written language might instead be considered conspicuous. The most prominent Norwegian dialect today is called Urban East Norwegian, and many people do consider this variety a kind of unofficial standard. This is essentially a kind of spoken bokmål, which traces its origins to Western Oslo and the prestigious Danish-Norwegian hybrid language once spoken there. This variety has spread and mixed with surrounding dialects, radiating out from Oslo, and is now the main dialect for many people living in this area. This form of spoken Norwegian is the one usually taught to foreigners and the one described in Norwegian grammars. But in learning or speaking Norwegian, you should nevertheless be prepared to encounter a lot of spoken and often even written variation. As for the dialects throughout Norway, these are traditionally divided into a western and an eastern branch, as you can see here. The most prominent feature of these two areas is the intonation, which in the Western dialects is more leveled and falling, while in the Eastern ones it's instead quite rising, and you'll be able to hear this difference in the samples later on. Anyway, there's also another four-way division of the Norwegian dialects. This division is more commonly seen today, and also corresponds better to how Norwegians themselves perceive the various dialectal areas. Each of these groups have a set of defining characteristics, but there's also a lot of variation within each group, and all of them can of course be divided even further. But in any case, it's important to note that speakers of most dialects have little trouble understanding each other, and most people are also quite used to adapting their speech when encountering people speaking another variety. And if Norwegian hasn't struck you as unique thus far, it's time for yet another striking feature of the language, namely its optional forms and freedom of choice between them. It so happens that foreigners are not the only ones to question the use of having two written standards for the same language, and so during the first half of the 20th century, several attempts were made to bring them closer to each other with the ultimate goal of merging them into a single, common Norwegian written standard. But since bokmål and nynorsk is basically all I've been talking about so far, this obviously failed. But it did result in a number of new forms entering both varieties, with many of them being made optional, meaning that every person is free to choose whichever form they wish as long as they're being consistent. In bokmål, the optional forms usually represent a conflict between reintroduced Norwegian forms and original Danish forms, called radical or moderate, as we can see in these examples. Sju, kasta, and boka are radical, originally Norwegian forms, and syv, kastet, and boken are moderate, originally Danish forms. In nynorsk, optional forms instead usually represent different dialectal forms, and there's no historical opposition between them. Examples of this are væra and være, me and vi, and tenkjer and tenker. Relationship-wise, Norwegian belongs to the North Germanic languages of the Indo-European language family. This makes it closely related to languages such as Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic, more distantly related to languages like English, Dutch, and German, and very distantly related to languages like French, Spanish, Russian, Greek, and Hindi. Swedish and Danish are the closest relatives of Norwegian, and the three languages are generally considered to be mutually intelligible, meaning that speakers of these languages can use their own languages with each other and expect to be understood, especially if written. How well this works in practice varies a lot from person to person, but especially Norwegians and Swedes will tend to communicate with each other in their own languages, and Norwegian speakers are also better at understanding Swedish and Danish than the other way around, not unlikely because Norwegians are used to a lot of variation in their own language already. As an example of the similarity of the three Scandinavian languages, let's take the phrase "I've bought myself a new car", which in Eastern Norwegian is "Jeg har kjøpt meg en ny bil". And upon seeing this, there should be no wonder that these languages are intelligible to each other, right? Now, moving on to grammar, Norwegian nouns have no cases, but they do have three genders: masculine, feminine, or neuter. Although in moderate bokmål, the feminine gender is optional, and it's quite common to use the masculine forms instead, which is similar to how it works in Swedish and Danish. So in bokmål, we get en bil, ei bok, and et hus, meaning a car, a book, and a house, respectively. Now, a peculiarity in the nouns is that the definite article is attached to the end of a word, instead of being independent, like English the. So, from the indefinite words just mentioned, we get the definite forms bilen, boka, and huset, meaning the car, the book, and the house, respectively. As for the verbs, there's no conjugation for person. So, for example, to live is lever in the present tense, levde in the past, and har levd in the perfect, no matter what person is doing the living. This is unlike English, where you say, for example, I live, but she lives, and so on. And besides grammar, there's also an interesting thing to note about the pronunciation of Norwegian: the pitch accent. Simply put, this is a kind of tone contrast where a word can have either accent 1 or accent 2, and where this can change the meaning of a word entirely. So, for example, with the Eastern accent shown here, we have hender and henner, where the first means hands and the second means happens. Other such pairs are vatne and vatne, and bønner and bønner, which, despite the spelling, are otherwise identical in pronunciation. Alright, to round off, I'm gonna let you listen and read along to two texts in Norwegian. The first one is a passage from the 1991 novel Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder, written in moderate bokmål and read with a local accent by a native speaker from the Østfold region. The original title is Sophies Verden, and it is an international bestseller, having been translated into 59 different languages.
Det triste at ikke bare tyngdeloven vi venner oss til etter hvert som vi vokser opp. Vi venner oss i samme slengen til hele verden som sådan. Det kan se ut som om vi i løpet av oppveksten mister evnen til å være forundret over verden. Men da mister vi noe vesentlig, noe filosofene prøver å vekke til liv igjen. For et sted inni oss det noe som sier at livet en stor gåte. Det noe vi en gang opplevde, lenge før vi hadde lært å tenke det.
The next passage is from the 1963 novel The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas, written in nynorsk and read with a local accent by a native speaker from the Sunnhordland region. Its original title is Isslottet, and it is considered a classic of Norwegian literature, being awarded the Nordic Council's Literature Prize in 1964.
Vintersola hadde omsider kommet så høyt at hun slapp ned til ispalasset. Den sene kalde sola hadde likevel mye av sin kraft. Strålene gikk gjennom tjukke isvegger og vinkler og brester, og brøt lyset i underfulle mønstre og farger, så det trøsteløse rommet dansa. Istappene ned fra taket, og de som vokste oppover fra gulvet, og selve dråpene, og alt danset med i dette lyshavet som brøt inn. Medan dråpene glimta og storkna, og gjorde for hver gang det vesle rommet en dråpe mindre.
And so, we're at the end of this presentation about the in many ways unique Norwegian language. Be sure to follow this channel for more videos about Norwegian and for introductions to other languages. Thank you for watching.